Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is video 16 from the Beginner to Chess Master playlist, which is a progressive series of videos. And I'd like to share with you a very important endgame, and that is the king-queen versus king-pawn type. Now, don't go anywhere. Your first impression may have already been, I got this, it's alright. When I have a queen, I'm going to win. When I have a pawn, it's unfortunate, but I'm going to lose. No. If that's your mentality or similar, you really should be tuned in right now, okay? Because it's not always a win-loss result. There are plenty of cases, more technical cases, but plenty of cases where the result is a draw. Are you familiar with them? What conditions must be present in order for it to be a draw? We want to make certain of something here. We want to know what position types in this endgame, what position types are in fact a win, and what ones are in fact a draw. Okay, we want to make certain we can win the won positions, earn that full point, and we want to make certain we can draw those drawn positions, earn that half point. There's a reason why I'm choosing to emphasize those terms, half and full. That will be revealed a little bit later, for the word half at least. But yeah, we want to make sure we can distinguish one from the other, okay? Now, do know that this is a non-prerequisite topic. I could have just as well shared this video within the first few in this playlist. There's no prior information necessary for you to fully understand everything that I'm about to share in this video. No prior video. You didn't need to watch any video prior to this one in order to understand everything that will be shared here, okay? And there will be plenty of topics I share like that, like this, in this playlist. Ones that are of the standalone type, let's say, okay? Now, as you may come to expect, if you've been tracking this playlist, I like to do things, express ideas and concepts by way of example. That will go unchanged. But what is going to change slightly is the ending of this video, where I have a pop quiz for you that you're going to fall in love with. Because everybody loves multiple choice, okay? And your choices are going to be, it's a win or it's a draw. And that's really the big question, okay? We want to know when it's a win and when it's a draw, okay? And if you're an experienced player listening right now, there may even be a question that stumps you. Ooh, what do I have up my sleeve? Okay, let's have a look at our first example, the one that we see before us. We're going to have a very quick look at this first example, where it is white to move. And just to be clear, in all the examples I share with you, and even during the pop quiz, it's going to be white to move. Okay, so let me show you what white can do in this position here to win. This position where the black pawn is 1.5 miles away from posing any serious threat to white, very far away from promotion land. What can white do? How about queen d6 for starters? That's nice. This pawn's going nowhere. And what does this mean? Wow, we have all day to improve our king, scoop up the pawn, and we're experts once we get here. Great. Let's try another one. One that is much more technical by comparison. This one here, whew, quite a ways this guy has come, right? Now he's only a single step away. Okay, these are really the ones we are going to focus on. The one where the pawn is much closer to queening. It's white to move. If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what move you would play here as white, and more importantly, try to figure out, is it a win or is it a draw? Okay. The answer, it's a win, but you need to be precise. There's only one move here that will allow white to win. What is that? Queen A1. Great. Similar to what we just saw in the last example, right? This is the first simple point. If the queen can safely establish herself somewhere in front of the pawn, it's going to be a win. The pawn can't bother her position. The king can't even think about approaching the queen, and we have, I've said this phrase just a moment ago, we have all day to go ahead and hunt that pawn down and then win the king-queen versus king endgame. Great. We're getting there. Let's change things just a hair. Instead of the king being on c2, suppose he is now on b2. Ooh, how is this different? Let's see. Again, it's white to move. If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what move you would play here as white. We certainly don't want to go to a1 now. What move would you play here as white, and is it a win or a draw? Okay, this is a draw. Let me just clear the board there. It's a draw. Am I kidding you? I'm not. Maybe a surprise to many of you. You got to be kidding. Black only has a pawn. I got a queen. I have to be able to win. No, you can't win. Why not? Well, let's see. Queen check. Right, we have to do something to disrupt the black king here, because otherwise black is just going to get a queen. Got to try to stop that. Here's one way to try to stop that. We could give a check. King b1. Threatening again. Check. Here. What kind of progress is this? Not progress at all. Here's something you don't want to do as black. You don't want to get in the way of your pawn. Why not? Well, you always want to be threatening to promote the pawn. And here's another reason why it's really bad in this case. That's already mate. Ooh. Okay, so in other words, if we have these checks here, the king just always stays out of the pawn's way. But let's try something else, because we're not making progress by giving these rank checks. So suppose we try some file checks. Yeah, let's say we go with b4. Okay, king goes to the corner. Aha! This is the first moment where we can now improve our king position, right? Because the pawn can't move. So king g7, right? No. Game's already over. Stalemate. This is really the main issue. This is the reason why white cannot win. It's because black has this stalemate resource. The king just tucks himself away in the corner, and if the queen does not open up one of these squares for our king to move to, it'll be stalemate. So there's no time to get our king, who's way out of play currently. There's no time to get that king involved in helping to track down the pawn. So what else can be tried? I guess you could give a check, another check, but it's the same story. Queen here is already stalemate. And that's really the big story here, or the little story involved with an A pawn, a rook pawn, in other words. This could also be an H pawn. It's the same thing going on. Yeah. These guys here, who are a single square away from promotion, these will result in a draw, assuming that the white king in this case, the side with the king and queen, that king is out of play. He's a long way off from helping to contribute. Okay, let's have a look at another example. Instead of working with an A pawn, how did this position start? Let's just clear it out. We had this position right here. So now the only thing that's going to change is, instead of having the pawn on A2, we are now working with a pawn on C2. Okay, how is this different? Well, let's see. It's white to move. If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what you would do in this position, and is it a win or a draw? Okay. This too is a draw. How? Well, black's ready to promote. We need to do something disruptive to the king, so this is what you can try. Queen to b4, giving a check along the file. King goes to the corner. We don't want to obstruct the pawn like this, because this would be white's time to now improve the king position. Black isn't in stalemate right here. He could go to this square. We don't want to obstruct the pawn. King here is best, threatening to promote. How can white stop this? You could give a check. You could give another check. Aha! Now white has black, right? You may be thinking. If the king goes here, queen takes pawn. Therefore, I have to go to this square here to defend the pawn, because I don't want to lose my pawn, right? Wrong. You should be going to the corner, knowing full well that this pawn, if taken, will result in stalemate. This is another pawn. There's the A pawn, there's the C pawn, and also these corresponding squares, these corresponding file pawns, the F pawn and H pawn, that when one square away from promotion, when the king is close by to aid in that pawn's advance, and I know there's a lot of little conditions here, and the enemy king here, the white king in this case, is a long ways off from helping to contribute. These are all cases, all situations where the end result will be a draw. Let me just put that up there. A pawn, C pawn, F pawn, H pawn. Now, a little tip, it will require a little bit of your imagination here, but a little tip that you can use just as a reminder, how are you to maybe remember that these are the pawns that will result in a draw or that half point? Well, let's see. We have the H pawn, the letter H, the letter A, the letter C, and if just use your imagination a little bit, just suppose that the letter C just turned into a person for a moment and kind of stretched out. It kind of turns into the letter L. And we have the letter F. We have these pawns here, these file pawns, basically spelling out the word half. Okay, these are the ones that will result in that half point. Again, they need to be a single square away from promoting. The enemy king needs to be far away, like in the examples he was on H8, and our king needs to be near the action, of course. The black king in these cases needs to be near the action, helping to aid in that pawn's advance. And, of course, the queen, we, of course, can't allow the queen to position herself in front of those pawns. So there's a lot of little conditions. But, yeah, these are the file pawns. The H file, the A file, the C file that I'm having you imagine as an L for a moment, just to create that word half, and the F pawn. Okay? These are the ones that can result in a draw using those stalemate resources. Okay, well, you may be curious about a different pawn, ones that we haven't touched on, like a D pawn or a center pawn. Whether it's a D pawn or an E pawn, it's going to be the same story. Okay? What about now? Can we finally win this position? Well, I'll put it to you. If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what you can come up with. Is this a win or is this a draw? And what would you do? Okay, the solution, it's a win. How, though? What is the method, what is an approach we can take in order to win this position? Well, let's see. We can start first with the move queen to e4, and maybe let me just back up for a moment. There are some key squares to be familiar with. What are these key squares? Well, it's the squares right behind the pawn. The d3 square and its neighbors, e3 and c3. These are the three key squares our queen will do very well to be positioned on. d3, e3, c3, she does a very good job. Why? Well, we're going to see that soon enough. Just a quick note, she gives check often and keeps pressure on this pawn from all three of these squares. She'll always put pressure on the pawn from all three of these squares and sometimes even be giving check. So she'll have a great influence, in other words, on both of the black pieces, the king and pawn. So an excellent start, knowing that we want to get to these three key squares, these ones right here. An excellent start is queen to e4. Now we have a couple squares we can make use of next. King's in check. King f1. We give another check and get to that one key square d3. The king has to now go to e1 to defend the pawn. And now we make use of another key square, e3. Pressure on the pawn, giving check, and what are we doing with this last move? We are forcing the king to go to d1, as otherwise we win the pawn. And once the king is on d1, this is when our king's eyes should light up. This is his moment to run to the rescue, right? This is his moment to approach the pawn. King G7. As soon as this pawn can't move, that's when our king improves his position. King C2, it's back on where the pawn is ready to move. We need to do similar and eventually force the king back in front of the pawn so that our king could slowly improve his position. Takes some work. We give another file check. File checks are very good. Do know this. What is maybe a reason why, let's say, a file check is a good idea when compared to, let's say, a rank check? If you could just imagine a king being checked along a rank, there is the possibility for a pawn to move when he is checked by a queen along a rank. Let me see if I could just illustrate this real quick. Suppose we just have this check for a moment, and the king goes here, and now we can do something like this, right? What are we doing? We're giving a check along a rank. The king doesn't necessarily have to move when there's a rank check, does he? In this case, absolutely not. The pawn could move and block the check and get the queen. Why am I covering this? It's because when you give file checks, it's impossible for the pawn to move and block a file check. And that's good news for us because we don't want this pawn to move forward, do we? King D3, Queen D5, King E2, and we move forward. Queen E4, King F2, we're at one of those key squares, D3. King has to go to E1 to defend the pawn, and we're already seeing a pattern. We've been here before, making use of D3, and then E3. It can happen where we make use of D3 and then even go to C3. King has to go to D1. He's now blocking the pawn. Our king's eyes light up. Here he comes. King C2, and here we go. King D3, Queen D5. The king now goes to C2, but also let me point out, suppose the king goes to one of these two and says, I'm not going to allow your queen to, meet King C2 with King C4 and meet King E2 with King E4. I'm just going to go here. Well, in this position, is the pawn even threatening to promote successfully? No. We can improve the king here. You promote, we take the queen. To be a little bit careful, right? It's not stalemate. There's actually one square for the king to go to, but the short story here is that on this check, if the king is going to one of these two, the pawn isn't even threatening to queen successfully. Okay, well, in this example, he goes to C2. Now we approach these three key squares, Queen C4 with check, King B1, Queen D3, King C1 has to go there to defend the pawn, and now a similar pattern going on, except this time on the other side. Making use of C3, king has to go and block the pawn. Here comes our king. And it's the same story. We give these file checks. We're making use of these three key squares, D3, E3, king is blocked. Here comes our king. We can make use of D3 straight away now that our king is this close. Queen C3, the blocking one more, and look at how far our king has come. Just a couple moves away now from not only picking up the pawn, but giving checkmate. Okay, so what have we learned here? Well, a center pawn, a D pawn or an E pawn, a single square away from promoting, will be a win. Okay, we could go ahead and win by making use of, in this case, by making use of these three key squares and eventually forcing the king to obstruct the pawn, and then that is our moment for our king to slowly make some progress. Okay, a lot of queen moves and then a king move. A lot of queen moves and then a king move. Okay, let's have a look at another example. Instead of a center pawn, let's have a look at the B pawn. And what we'll soon find out is that there's something similar going on with this. Keeping an eye on these three key squares. We can first start with this file check. King B3, Queen B5, King to one of these two is not threatening to promote. King c2, king c4. One of the key squares. Pressure on both pieces. The king now has to obstruct the pawn. Here comes our king. King a2. And this is a little bit different, this next move, and it involves the knight pawns. Here's a nice little move for the queen. Queen c2. Let me just point out that if the king goes to a3, simple enough, right? The pawn is stopped cold, and we can move our king multiple times in a row and eventually scoop him up. So what does this mean? After king c2, king a3, we go here, so therefore, king a1. And now in just one move, queen a4, he's immediately forced to b1. Time to move the king, because the pawn can't move. King f6, king c1, an only move. We give some more file checks, eventually making use of, again, these three key squares. So hopefully you're seeing the pattern here. Queen c2, king a1, she's revisiting a4. It's the same story over and over. Pawn is blocked. That's our time for the king to improve. Making use of those three key squares behind that pawn. And eventually we will be mating. Actually, we don't even have to pick up the pawn here. We can just mate with queen c2. Not the only way to win. A longer way is to go here, pin the pawn, and next win the pawn, and eventually hunt down the king. But yeah, this would work too, huh? Checkmate just straight away with the pawn still on board. Okay, so this is the big thing to take away thus far. We already saw with the h pawn, the a pawn, the c pawn that I had you imagine stretch out to an L, and the f pawn forming the word half. Those guys result in that half point, that draw. Whereas these guys here, they could be one step away, but that's all right. We'll be able to go on to win. Okay? Let's have a look at another example. Not many more here before that pop quiz. Suppose we are now working with this one right here, where we have an a pawn who is 2 squares away from queening. We already know that if the pawn was here, it would be a draw. And, you know, just from knowing that piece of information, this is already influencing a position that's one ply back, you know, one move back. Now that we know if he gets to this square here, it's going to be a draw. We can't let that happen, you know. It may be very tempting to be like, okay, well, my king, he's way out of play. Let's get him going. No. After pawn here, oh, it's a draw. One wrong slip. You have to know that this position is a draw, and because of that, you shouldn't be moving your king. What should white do? Queen to b5, giving a file check. King a1, he wants to allow this pawn to move, and now we can actually do something a little bit clever here as white. Queen c4. Oh, but this is allowing the pawn to move. Well, actually, we have a threat in mind. If the pawn goes to a2, that is checkmate. So this is a nice little trick to be familiar with. These checkmates on c1 or even f1, when our opponent is trying to promote the rook pawns, getting the queen to those squares. Those 2 squares. Queen c4 is a fine move here. a2 is met with checkmate. So black has to do something else. King to b2. And now we make use of b4. Okay, we don't have 3 squares. You know, when we had a center pawn, I had 3 key squares. There's only 2 key squares behind the pawn that we should be looking to get to. Okay, and we could do that after king b2, queen b4. Where does the king go? King a2. And now that the pawn is blocked, we can improve our king and know that on black's next move, guess where he has to go? He has to go to a1. There's only one legal move here, and we can just scoop up the pawn. It's very important, again, from this initial position, we don't think, hey, our king is out of play, let's get him going. No. If this pawn gets here, black will be able to draw, unless, you know, there's that situation where we could immediately make use of c1 straight away as soon as the pawn moves and the king is in the corner. But yeah, you can't just think about improving your king here. You have to recognize this position here is a draw. So let's not allow black to acquire that position. Giving checks is the correct approach here with the queen. Eventually getting to these key squares, b4 in this case, and soon we just scoop the pawn up. Let's have a look at one more example here, this time involving the c pawn. If you happen to be a more experienced player tuned in right now, you might even take something away from this example here. There's a nice, efficient position that I'll be highlighting here. So we have a case where we're working with a c pawn, that letter C stretched out as an L. This is one of those, if he is on this square right here, it's one of those half-point pawns. Okay, we can't allow this guy to get to c2. There's only one move we could do here that will successfully stop its advance. It's the move queen to e5, taking advantage of this pin. Now what does black do? King to b3. Queen d4 is an excellent post for the white king, or excuse me, the white queen. Why? Striking at this pawn along a diagonal like this is excellent. When we have a pawn like this that is 2 squares away from promoting, if we can put pressure on it along a diagonal like this, the d4 post is excellent. Let me explain. From this position, where can the black king be where he defends the c3 pawn? What squares must he be on in order for the pawn to stay defended? He has to be on b3, b2, or c2. Okay, these squares are blocked off by the white queen. She's very close by, stopping the king from being on other squares where he could defend the pawn. So there's only 3 squares where the king can still be defending the pawn. It's black to move, and also know that if the king is on b2 or c2, the pawn is not threatening to move, which means we can improve our king position. Why can't the pawn move if he's on c2? This should be clear. What about if he's on b2? Well, the pawn is in a pin. So the only square the king could really stay on and have the pawn move is on b3. So suppose the pawn moves. Is this a draw? It's not. And the reason for that is because we can make use of first a1, and then we are guaranteed to get to c1 next safely. Okay, we can't just pick any route. You know, we can't just go here with check thinking we're going to get here next. No, because of king b2. And we're not getting here, and the result will be a draw. So the short story here is that this efficient post by the white queen, when we have a pawn that's a couple squares away from promoting, striking at this pawn along a diagonal like this really does a good job in stopping the pawn from moving, and yeah, either stopping the pawn from moving because it's illegal, like this, or, you know, like this because the king is in the way. And if the pawn does move, we go here, and then here next, and then it's a very fast track to approaching the pawn. Okay? So we would actually, it wouldn't be like this example here where we had the d pawn with just him being 1 square away from queening, where we would have to make multiple queen moves, you know, multiple queen moves and then a king move, multiple queen moves, and then a king move. It wouldn't be like that when the pawn is 2 squares away from queening. We can actually just keep moving our king, knowing that you know, this pawn isn't going to go anywhere. And if he tries to move, a quick a1 to c1, and he's stopped cold. Okay, let's have a look at just one more example, And then we're going to have three more examples and then that test. Pop quiz. Maybe you don't like the term test. Okay, here you go. One more, where we're working with an e-pawn 2 squares away. Even if, we already covered center pawn 1 square away, so if it's a center pawn or even a B pawn, that's now, let me just highlight them. If these are the file pawns that are 1 square away, it's a win. So as you might expect, if the pawn is 2 steps away, that too will be a win. Okay, that's just the very quick point I wanted to make with that example. And now these last two are working with now the king finally being a little bit closer to the action. Just to give you a feel for these positions, suppose that the king is a little bit more involved in trying to hunt down the f-pawn, one of the pawns that sometimes can result in a draw. Well, it's not going to be a draw here, and let's see why. The king is closer. He's close enough, let's say, in this position. He's just a single square away. Black is working with one of the bishop pawns, the c pawn, f pawn. 1 square away with those guys. The king is just a move away from getting to this key third rank. We can start with queen e2. King g1. Just a quick note, if king h1 we don't want to take here, that's stalemate. What we could do is improve our king like this and pick up the pawn next, or maybe even give checkmate soon. Yeah, in just a couple from here. But in this position, he goes to g1. We can improve our king now. We can actually allow the pawn to promote. King g3 allows f1 equals queen because we can give mate on h2. Black can do something fancy like promote here and get a knight. That would give check. We would just scoot out of the way and mate would soon follow after that. The main idea here is that the king is closer to the action, so it's not always, it's an f-pawn who's 1 square away from queening, and our king is there to support its advance. It's going to be a draw because of that stalemate resource. No, that was when the king was a long ways away. We don't have that. The timing is just not right because the king is closer to the action here. Okay, let's have a look at just one more example where the king is closer, this time working with a rook pawn. He can in fact be even a couple squares away from this key third rank when working with a rook pawn, and it will still be a win. First move, queen e2. If he goes to g3, we'll be able to get here. So he goes to g1. We can improve the king, allow black to get a queen, and even play king g3, and there is not a successful check that the black queen can give white here. There's one tricky little move maybe with queen f3, trying to get white to take the queen with the queen, because that would be stalemate. But white has another option. King takes queen, king in the corner. Black has a legal move, and then we can give mate. Short story here is that the king is close enough. He's within a couple ranks when fighting against this rook pawn from promoting. Can actually allow black to get a queen, improve the king, and then be in this position where there is not a good move. We have all sorts of mates lined up against black, and again, not a good check for black to throw at white. Okay? I believe that is all the examples I have for you. And so at this point, and as mentioned at the start, I now have a group of 10 puzzles to share with you, 10 problems where if you'd like to, at this point, and I would encourage this, is that you just take out a piece of paper and mark it 1 through 10. Your answers are either going to be W or a D for it's a win or it's a draw. And I'm initially going to just present all 10 of these problems. I will give you a few seconds to go ahead and pause the video while the puzzle position stays up there. Spend as long as you want trying to work it out, and then unpause it, and you'll see what puzzle 2 is. I'm just going to be giving a few seconds with each of these puzzles to show them, and then I'm going to revisit them and show you the solutions, or in most cases just tell you what the solution is, and in some cases do a little bit of explaining. Okay, so here we go. With that said, get ready for the first one. Again, I'm just going to be giving a few seconds with each of these, and do know it is white to move in each case. Here is the first one. Giving you just a few seconds. Is it a win or is it a draw? 3, 2, 1. Okay, here comes problem number 2. 3, 2, 1. Here comes problem number 3. Is it a win? Is it a draw? It's the same question for each of these. 3, 2, 1. Here comes number 4. 3, 2, 1. Here's number 5 coming up. A few seconds for this, for you to pause. Okay, here comes number 6. 3, 2, 1. Okay, here comes number 7. 3, 2, 1. Number 8, just a few more. Problem number 8 right here. Problem number 9 coming up. Here is problem 9. Okay, and here is the final problem, number 10. So spend as long as you want with these. Okay, and now for the answers. So let's just go through here. I'm assuming, well, I'm hopeful that many of you actually did take out a piece of paper and, write the numbers 1 through 10 out and just had a quick little W or a D for each of the answers. So let's see how you did. Problem number 1, let's see how well you grasp this topic. It's okay if you, make some mistakes. That's maybe your hint to maybe rewatch a part of this video or not. Okay, that's on you, of course. But okay, problem number 1. If you said it's a win, well done. The first one is a win for white. Number 2. This is also a W. 2 W's in a row. So what does that mean? There's got to be, it means number 3 has to be a draw, right? That's what you think. And if you thought this one was a draw, problem number 3 here, you are right. This is a draw. So far, so good, right? How are we doing? 3 for 3 for the majority of you. I hope. How about number 4? Win or a draw? This is a win. 2 squares away? That's a win. Number 5. This is a draw. We're working with one of those, H, A, C, F, that letter C I had you envision stretching out as an L. Those are the half-point pawns. The drawing pawns. 1 square away. Number 6 puzzle. This is a win for white. Number 7. Actually, let me point out why this is a win. We could give a check along the file. King here. And similar to what we had before, I've shown, an A pawn a couple squares away, from queening. Queen c6 prevents this advance because of queen c1, so this is something to keep in the back of your mind. So king here, we could go to this square without fear of a2. King b2, we could slowly get behind here, continually threaten queen c1 should the pawn push, and eventually we get to those key squares, right? Now we can move the king and then scoop up the pawn. So this is, again, problem 6, and it is a win. Let's have a look at number 7. Puzzle number 7. This is maybe one of the more tricky ones because now we have the king a little bit closer, but is he close enough? He isn't close enough. He needs to actually be one more rank closer. This one may have stumped many of you. This is a draw. You can review that part of the video to refresh your understanding of that. Here's number 8. Is it a win or a draw? This is a win. May even be been very close to identical to how I presented it. This is a win. The king is close enough. King g4, promote. King g3, a little bit of calculation, a few moves deep there. This is a won position. Number 9. This is also a win. Don't lose sight. Queen a1. we saw that very early on. It could be very easy to be caught up in, oh, is the king close enough? Oh, we're working with a rook pawn that's only a single square away. It's a draw. Oh, no. The queen could go here, just in the nick of time, and this will be a win. And the last example, last problem, number 10. Have any of you gone 9 for 9 up until this point? Are you going to get 10 for 10? The results, the answer for this one is, and don't be upset if you didn't get this one correct, it's okay. This one is a draw. Okay, I think many of you may have chalked this one up as a W, but let me explain. This is, because of this example here, and I'm sure there are many others, not too many, but because of an example like this, it's, how to say, because there are situations like this on board, I can't say, well, when any of the pawns are 2 squares away from promoting, it's always a win. I can't say that, because here's a case where it's not a win, and the pawn is 2 squares away from queening. Well, a lot of interesting things have to be present on board in order for this to actually be a draw, and that's what we're faced with here. The pawn is ready to promote, or excuse me, ready to get to c2, where he is 1 square away from promoting, and we know if this is achieved, it will be a drawn position. So we can try queen b7 check. Okay, there really isn't any other way we can stop this pawn from moving. We can play queen b7 check, and now there is one move that will save the draw. There's an only move for black. King c1, threatening to get the pawn 1 square away from queening. There isn't a diagonal check that white can give to black, right? You can't get on this diagonal or this one here safely. So how else do you stop the pawn from pushing besides returning to the square you came from on h1? After king b2, we're just repeating moves. There's no good way forward here, and it's a very atypical position, rare position, but yeah, the queen is in the corner, and this king is actually getting in the way of white going on to win. Notice if the king wasn't on h8, suppose this position began, let me just make a couple moves here to get the king on a different square. If he's not on h8, now it's a win. Why? Because the queen could go to h8, and similar to what I showed when the queen was on this square here, d4, cutting into the pawn, striking at the pawn along a diagonal, it's a similar story here. If the king is going to c2, well, well, excuse me, the queen could just go to d4 next, actually, right? Once she's on h8, she can next go to d4, and we have that same position, right? This should look familiar. So I just wanted to point out, and again, that's the reason why I really wanted to, when presenting this topic, I really wanted to be able to give that type of information to you, like, hey, when the pawn is 2 squares away from queening, I don't care what file it's on, it's always a win? No, I can't say that, because this is an example here where, no, it's actually not going to be a win. Okay, I really like to share, that kind of cut and dry type of information, that black and white type of phrase. I really wanted to do something like that, but here's a case now, because of this situation, I couldn't do that. Okay, but it's almost always the case where when one of the pawns is 2 squares away from promoting, it doesn't matter what file it's on, it's almost always a win. Okay, so there was a lot covered here. As usual, I've lost track of how long the video's been going on. It's an involved endgame. Okay, there's a lot of different details here. Feel free in the comment section below to let me know how you did with the little test. Don't be too upset, especially for this last example here. I imagine it stumped many. I would not be surprised if an experienced player chimed in and said, hey, if they were being just completely honest and open about it, I wouldn't be surprised if they maybe even stumbled on this one as well. But use that little test as some type of gauge to see how well you really digested what was delivered here. Maybe something you have to rewatch, maybe just part of it here or there. But yeah, okay, king and queen versus king and pawn. That can be tricky, right? There's some draws, there's some wins. We need to know the difference between the two, and this will help us make better decisions before we even get to these simplified points in a game. Okay, so as usual, I hope you got something out of this video. Again, leave some feedback in the comment section below. Let me know how you did on that test. Did anybody go 10 for 10? Let me know in the comment section below, and I look forward to sharing video 17 with you. So that's all for now. Take care. Bye.